is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea, then the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
The Himalayan bumblebee produces hallucinogenic honey. Hi, I'm your host, Casual Caleb, and I'd like to welcome you to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Today we have a metric bevy of animal stories. We have an 82-year-old Hiroshima woman who fends off a bear by punching it in the face. We also have cows being traded for AK-47s in Nigeria. And after a few more animal stories, we're going to roll right into medieval knights being hired in Sweden in order to combat coronavirus. So that's old-fashioned horseback riding knights. And then we're going to go into a few weird laws that are trying to be passed. One of the most notable is in Minneapolis, where the Parks Board is trying to vote in legalizing toplessness. It's the only time I ever voted. And then we're going to wrap it all up with my top 10 insurance fraud scams. So let's dive right in with this first story. We're going to start off with cows being traded for AK-47s in Nigeria. Now, the purpose for this is, quote, an attempt to encourage them to give up a life of crime and live a normal life as responsible citizens. So the government is exclusively offering this deal to bandits and other criminals. So, in case you didn't have enough of an incentive to be a bandit, now you can do so in pursuit of getting a cow. So that's good news. The Nigerian governor Bello Matawalle, starting off with my mispronunciation of the week, said, quote, motorcycling armed bandits have been terrorizing the state. He goes on to accuse specifically the Fulani herders. That's a community in Nigeria. And he says, quote, they are being accused of being behind a wave of attacks. And he says that this new program to trade cows for their AK-47s will be successful simply because the Fulani herder community values cows highly. But this farmer community has gone on to say that they were in fact not behind the attacks, but are rather victims of the attacks. So not sure how this whole trading business is going to work out. Further problems develop as we take note of the value of a cow in Nigeria, which is around $260 or 200 euros. And the cost of an AK-47 is about $1,200 or 950 euros. So maybe if he would trade one AK-47 for 5 cows, that'd be more of a fair deal. But I think you should just find a different approach to this problem. But in his defense, he says, quote, these bandits who choose to repent initially sold their cows to buy guns, and now they want a life free of criminality. We are asking them to bring us an AK-47 and get 2 cows in return. This will empower and encourage them. Now, when the governor was asked to describe the attacks, he said, quote, they often loot shops, steal cattle and grain, and take people hostage for ransom. So, do you guys see the problem with this one? They often loot shops, steal cattle. So, if you use an AK-47 the way it's meant to be used, turns out you can get all the cattle you want. He wants to trade 2 cattle per AK-47. Holy Lord. But it's not all laughs. In fact, 21 people were killed last week alone as a result of the armed bandits. And in the last decade, more than 8,000 people have been killed, if you include their attacks on the neighboring country of Niger. But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, folks. You leave a comment and let me know how you think this is going to turn out. The governor went on to defend his position, saying that most residents of Zamfara, which is one of the major provinces of Nigeria, said that the state are involved in agriculture. The state model, in fact, is, quote, "Farming is our pride." That's a great state motto. Next week we're going to do top 10 state mottos, because there's a lot of good ones out there. The governor concluded saying that the attacks are rooted in decade-long competitions over resources between ethnic Fulani herders and farming communities. He also promised to disband the camps in the forests where the gunmen are based. So he's gonna trade cows for AK-47s and disband the actual group. So that's good. We'll keep you informed on how this develops. But I remain skeptical, as I do in all matters. But for now, all I can do is go on to our next story, titled Holy Goat. A goat guards a Mississippi church. Now, Holy Goat was not this goat's God-given name. It was given to him by the locals, because the billy goat likes to hang out in front of the Rose Bower Missionary Baptist Church off of Highway 24 west of Macomb. I don't know what any of that means. I'm not from Missouri. But apparently this goat has been standing in front of the church, kind of guarding it, as the locals say. He's said to stay so still while guarding the church that he appears to be a piece of lawn art, much like you see in a nativity set. Apparently people keep chasing him away from the church. Billy goats are kind of scary. You know, they have weird demonish eyes, and in fact many churches consider him to be the harborer of demons. So they keep trying to chase him away from this church, but he insists on coming back and guarding it. Nobody's quite sure why. A couple of people suspect, this is kind of sad, they suspect that he lost a loved one nearby and is still waiting for them to show up. We have a turkey with the same situation here in Colorado. In Crystal Park, there's a turkey that walks between the streets, and a few months ago his wife was hit by a car, so now he just walks the streets waiting for his wife. He'll just bark at cars. It's kind of sad, which is why I laugh at it. Anyway, back to the story in Missouri. Most of the locals consider this to be a good goat. That's a direct quote. He's a good goat. So they're not too worried about him. One of the churchgoers said, quote, "It's not really bothering us. I guess when people come, he leaves anyway." So during the pandemic, people haven't been going to church, obviously. So the goat's been hanging out. But when they do show up, he usually bails. About a week after being discovered, the guy who runs the church actually caught him and tied him up in the backyard. Not like, you know, the way you tie up a damsel in distress. He just tied it around his neck. So eventually the goat escaped. Nobody knows quite how, but it's made him become kind of a celebrity around the church. Saying that it's God's will for the goat to roam free, that's sweet. Thanks, God. Thanks for looking out for the goats. And the goat has also attracted many travelers. There's a lot of people who drive through this small town in Missouri, and one of them says that she always stops by the church, finds the goat, and gives him some veggies. So that's nice. You know, he's making friends. It's more than I'm doing. And you'll have to forgive me for how I'm going to end this little story here. The latest nickname this goat has garnered is the Baptist goat. Once again, I apologize. All right, let's move on. I'm gonna save the story of the 82-year-old woman punching a bear and knocking it down. For now, we're gonna talk about a Kansas dog that makes a 50-mile trek back to her old home in, drumroll please, Missouri. So we have Missouri and Mississippi stories this week. That's great. So this dog's name is Cleo, and she disappeared from her home in Kansas earlier last month and eventually turned up in her old home in Missouri, which is about 50 miles away. She's a 4-year-old Labrador Retriever Border Collie mix. Oh, God. And so, yeah, she just kind of walked up to her old home that's 50 miles away. I'm not quite sure how she managed that. And the new family there tried to catch her, but she kept growling and biting at them. So she won't let anyone get near her, which is kind of funny. She just kind of wants to live in her own old house, which is sweet. But eventually dog catchers found her and caught her and checked the microchip in her brain, which I didn't know. I don't think it's in her brain. They checked the microchip in her head, which said that she lives in Kansas, about 50 miles southwest of her house in Missouri. Isn't that sweet? An old dog finding her way home. All right. Before we go to break, we're going to talk about an 82-year-old woman in Hiroshima who recently shooed away an attacking bear by striking it and knocking it backwards. All right, so the lady's name was Rumiko Sasaki, and she was treating weeds in her backyard with her husband in her Kita, Hiroshima residence when she found herself being attacked by a black bear. This occurred on July 16th. Sasaki said in an interview that she stood up from her work, she noticed a bear in front of her, and then it attacked her. Quote, "It took aim at my face and came at me suddenly. But I hit it and sent it flying back." All right. She only suffered minor scratches to her face, but the bear fled the scene immediately after being pushed. So I looked these bears up. They're actually pretty cute. They have a little V-shaped chest mark, a little white mark that's kind of like it looks like they're wearing a scarf. It's pretty adorable, but these things get up to about 800 pounds, so it's pretty amazing that this woman, through sheer tyranny of will, knocked this bear over and made it run away. So good for her. According to the local hunting association, there have been 252 bear sightings in this area, but this was the first attack on a person. It wasn't much of an attack, so note to self, bears are afraid of Hiroshima old ladies. I am kind of too. They say the main way to deter black bears in Japanese regions is to wear a bell. Apparently they're afraid of the high-pitched jingling sound, which is a great way to get rid of bears. We don't have that solution here in Colorado. We just get eaten. It's a bummer. But although they don't have much of a reputation for attacking humans, unfortunately they have a pretty horrible record when it comes to destroying farm habitats and crops and even some property. So black bears in Japan are dwindling because farmers are defending their property by shooting them. But Japan is proposing new and stringent protection policies for the animal, so I guess you can make your arguments for and against that however you wish. I'm not here to do that. That's for you guys to handle. But there's one thing I can tell you, and that's that this is the end of this segment. Stay tuned for after the break when we are going to talk about medieval knights on horseback used to fight coronavirus in Sweden. This is a great story if you're looking to be hired as a knight. Go on some Swedish websites and you might land yourself a job. So yeah, stay tuned after the break for that.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Baked beans are not actually baked, they are stewed. Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We talked a little bit about some funny animal stories, about a 82-year-old woman punching a bear, and a few other stories. We're going to go off and talk about some medieval knights riding on horseback in order to fight coronavirus. Stay tuned for later, when I will give you my top 10 insurance fraud schemes. But for now, we're going to go off on a little tangent. Or if you remember that 82-year-old who punched a bear, a few years ago, a 63-year-old fisherman fought off a black bear with karate. This, of course, also happened in Japan. So a 62-year-old man was fishing in Gunma Prefecture at the Zhu River, and a 6-foot-tall Asian black bear pounced on the man. Apparently this 62-year-old is a world-famous karate instructor. And how did he beat up this bear? Apparently, he punched it repeatedly in the eyes before the bear ran in retreat. He said, quote, "The bear was so strong. Just by leaping at me, it almost knocked me over. I thought I was going to die. But I poked it in the eye, and it turned around and ran away." So now you guys know how to fight off bears if they come across you. Just poke them in the eyes a couple times. And just like our 82-year-old heroic woman, this man also suffered minor scratches and bruises. But he was safe enough to drive himself to the hospital shortly after the encounter. But Japanese authorities said this is not the approach you should take. They said, quote, "If you see a bear, don't engage it. Walk away quietly and please report it to the authorities." So keep that in mind if you live in Japan and you're not good at karate. We're going to move on to a Swedish island named Gotland, which hired a troupe of medieval knights to safeguard against the spread of COVID-19. So Gotland, for those who don't know, is a very populous tourist destination in Sweden. So the Swedish government is concerned that people will flock to their beaches and spread COVID-19. So that's why they hired knights. This is how they're trying to keep the virus at bay. And so that they're taken seriously, they armed these knights with lances. So yeah, that'll make everybody take them seriously. They will not actually be enforcing a stay-at-home rule. They will just be patrolling hotspots and spreading the message that we are all in this together. And they will encourage holidaymakers to, quote, "take responsibility and ensure they minimize the risk of the virus spreading." So, of course, Sweden is one of the major countries that has been under scrutiny for how they've handled COVID. They did not enforce any lockdown at any time during the pandemic. But the leader of Sweden said, quote, "The Swedish constitution does not allow the government to declare a state of emergency. Under the Swedish constitution, freedom of movement is a fundamental right, and limiting such rights required a decision by the Swedish parliament." So they had an above-average death per capita, but currently the rates of infection are on the decline. Who's to say whether or not the knights going from beach to beach is a deterrent of the disease? But yeah, I think it's an interesting way to handle COVID, having knights patrolling your streets. I think that would be great to have here in America. First of all, I'd love no job as much as riding on a horse with a spear, just telling people to wear masks. Oh, that'd be very fun. All right, we're going to move on to another interesting way people are handling this pandemic. And this comes to us from the MLB, Major League Baseball. And it's starting up its season next week. But, of course, you're still not allowed to go in the stadiums, as that would be incredibly dangerous, and the MLB doesn't want COVID spreading around. They don't want all their customers to be killed. That's not a good way to handle your market. But nevertheless, they've come up with an interesting way to allow you to still show your support for your team, specifically the Tampa Bay Rays. And how are they doing this? Well, they're making it so you can purchase to have a cardboard cutout of yourself printed out and placed in the stands during the home games. Which is it's great news for people like me who can't stand to watch baseball. It should be noted that they have some guidelines for what you are allowed to post on your little cardboard cutout. There's no commercial advertisements, including slogans, websites, and phone numbers. No social media handles or hashtags. No offensive or negative references to any MLB team. No names of any MLB players. There can be no statements or endorsements of political candidates, and no third-party logos or branding. And all of this comes at the low cost of $60 and $40 if you are a season ticket holder. So, if you thought it was going to be boring not being able to go to every single Rays game this season, you now get a $20 discount to have a cardboard stand-in for yourself. So that's good news. Also, it's putting people to work. That looks really good on a resume. Oh, I went around placing cardboard cutouts in stands. The MLB has also announced that they will pump in crowd noises from video games to fill the otherwise quiet stadium. But I don't know. I think they're really stretching now to find ways to fund the Major League of Baseball. So yeah, that's an interesting take. I don't know. Maybe they'll fill the stands. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is how baseball games will be held in the future. Can you imagine being one of the players, by the way, who has to have a bunch of fake people staring at them during a several-hour-long game? It'd be kind of odd. And speaking of odd, anti-mask protesters are now wearing masks that offer no COVID-19 protection. So one of these anti-maskers said, quote, "I wore a mask that is designed for protecting your face in a paintball battle. You can easily breathe through it. I walked around the mask-required store, talked to employees and other shoppers, and everyone could see my open mouth." By the way, this is my Florida story of the week, in case you couldn't tell. He went on to say, quote, "It was almost like not wearing a mask at all. Nobody cared. That's because it's not about safety, it's about complacence." Now, some anti-mask movements actually make some sense to me. This one doesn't, but some of them do. The other day I went into a pawn shop that said no masks allowed, and I asked them why. It seemed odd, and what they said was, we've been robbed several times, because people just walk in wearing masks and you don't think twice about it, and then all of a sudden they pull out a gun and they're like, "Oh, you're wearing a mask. That is no good at all. We can't tell who you are. We have security cameras, but now they're useless because you're wearing a mask." So some of this makes sense on a small scale, but this incident itself that this anti-masker took advantage of occurred in a Tampa Walmart. Obviously a highly populated retailer, so it's kind of a different story. But the individual leading this movement said, quote, "Masks made of mesh, cohort, which is like yarn, or lace are now popular items being offered by internet retailers." And most of them include warnings stating, quote, "These items are not intended for protection or COVID use." So basically it's just used so you can say, "Oh, I'm wearing a mask," while you're in a Walmart, because now Walmart requires you wear masks. And this individual went on to say, quote, "Make your own anti-mask. Stylish, breathable, and don't protect you from a darn thing. Masks required? No problem. Breathe free while making a statement. No law requires a specific type or particulate rating of mask. This is about complacence, not safety." And in response, the the local health consultant said, quote, "Masks absolutely do work. They're not perfect. They're not the only measure you need to take to keep the virus under control, but they are very effective and they are very simple." So that's the counter argument. So I proposed both sides, so I can't be held responsible for any of you getting angry at me for telling this story. But I will point out a funny side effect of these anti-maskers promoting this story is that now all of the major retailers are on the lookout for people wearing improper masks. Part of the problem of bringing awareness to this, your little game here, playing around with the rules of the retailers, is that now the retailers are going to be aware of the game you're playing. So they're going to be looking out for fake masks. It'll probably be easy to get away with some of them, but more difficult for others, such as this one described in the story, with a man walking around with an open mouth mask. So that kind of backfires on the movement. Alright, and we're going to wrap this little COVID segment with Florida gangs terrorizing residents with massive COVID-19 parties. So once again, this comes from our good friends over in Florida, and What's occurring is these, quote, unsavory people have been renting vacation homes in gated communities and holding huge COVID-19 parties. So we covered this a little bit last week. Essentially what a COVID-19 party is people get together, some of which have COVID-19, and they have the individuals there have the hopes of spreading the disease in order to become immune to it, so they don't have to worry about it. Seems like it defeats the purpose. You know, why would you get the disease so you can protect yourself from getting the disease later? I'm not sure if it makes sense. Maybe there's a good argument in there. Leave a comment below, and maybe I'll address it in my next video. But anyway, these parties have been getting more and more attention. So what happens is a bunch of residents nearby complain of the parties. You know, they know what's going on now. It's been in the news, especially at the local news in California. And the police chief said, quote, last week, some folks in the crowd threw some fireworks at the deputies that were there. So the deputies showed up at the parties to disperse it. And the gang members threw fireworks at them. He goes on to say, quote, we did the right thing. They backed out. They waited for extra resources to arrive, and then we went in and took care of the party. We dispersed it. A gun was later recovered from that party. So be on the lookout. Some of these parties range from 50 to 100 people. You know, especially if this is happening near you, you don't want to get the disease. So make sure you don't let these people give you a disease. It's not okay. Come on, people. Come on, Florida. No, I love the Florida people. And as a PSA, I am now going to read another quote from the sheriff. He said, quote, these are being referred to, from what I am being told, COVID-19 parties, where they're actually getting together and they're trying to mingle to potentially spread the virus amongst each other if they're asymptomatic or whatever the case might be. We've just seen a tremendous spike just here in Ocalanta County. Residents of the gated communities are, quote, living life of terror right now. So, don't freak people out and go to a bunch of COVID parties. That's not cool. That's not Christian. But, they've reportedly taken care of this gang problem. So that's good news. Just keep your eyes open, folks. Stay alert for parties. We have to watch out for parties now. That's how crazy 2020 has gotten. All right, anyways. It's time to go to a break now. Stay tuned. After the break, we're going to talk about a couple of sexy stories. There was a body found by railroad tracks that turned out to be a sex doll. We'll get into that. And then in Minneapolis, the Parks Board are set to vote on legalizing toplessness. So we'll delve deep into that after the break, so stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
It is illegal to kill Bigfoot in Washington and Texas. Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. I just gave you some weird COVID stories for the week, including medieval knights on horseback protecting the beaches of Sweden. That's a good one. That's a good conversation starter. But now we're going to go into some sexy stories of the week. Maybe some not so sexy stories. I need to stop laughing. I got some criticism. I'm not going to lie to you folks. I get criticized a lot. I got some criticism saying I laugh too much. So for this segment, I'm going to try not to laugh. All right, so we're going to start with a Minnesota story. So in the state of Minnesota, it's technically legal for a person with breasts. That's their little side note. That it has to be a person with breasts. It's legal for a person with breasts to go topless if they want to, as long as they are not being, quote, lewd. Based on past citations, being lewd sometimes means, quote, taking off your shirt at a sporting event or sunbathing. I agree, sunbathing should be banned. But a park board ordinance recently said, quote, they prohibit female breasts being shown below the top of the areola. I'll leave you to Google what that means. But many people are up in arms about this, pointing out that it's weirdly specific and doesn't make a whole lot of congenial sense. A woman named Helena Howard recently got cited for being topless at a Minneapolis beach while quietly reading a book, was willing to go to court to prove that this was an absurd law. But unfortunately, her case got thrown out as soon as she lawyered up. But as of July 15th, the park is now going to vote on eliminating the ordinance altogether, leaving it up to the state statute. Commissioner Chris Mayer replied to the ordinance, "Elsewhere in Minneapolis, people of all genders can be topless in public. In spaces where men are allowed to go shirtless, women and transgender people should be allowed to as well." And he said that if this law is not, if his position is not promoted, then the reverse should be true as well. If it's not okay for women to go topless, then men shouldn't be able to either. Which is fine. I'm big and fat, so I wear my shirt in public anyways. And during the weekend's protest, they held protests on this. One of the protesters asked city leaders, quote, if they had a vendetta against families, and if we should set up homeless camps in the parks, add in some nude communes, and then send our children to play on the new playgrounds on our tax dollars. So there's a lot of people upset about the fact that women might be able to go topless in a park, so long as she is not being, quote, lewd. And as a small development in this story, there was a big old goddamn controversy this weekend. A lot of people were laying on a beach. Some of them were topless. And parents were sending out many complaints. That's what the officers said. Quote, there were many complaints. So how did they handle this? They sent a drone over the beach, and they recorded who was topless and who was not. Which is kind of creepy. And then after that, they went out and they gave tickets to everybody who was topless. And you can go online and search some videos that were taken during the whole incident. The people at the beach got very, very upset. Started recording the police handing out tickets, started yelling at them. And the police, they yelled back a little bit. So, nice. I told you that was a somewhat not so sexy story, but now we're going to move on to our second not so sexy story. This happened in Georgia at 2 p.m. The Liberty County Sheriff's Office, Detective Mike Albritton, said officers found an object laying on the side of railroad tracks. By law, the officers are ordered not to touch the deceased person until a coroner arrives, so they simply placed a sheet over the suspected body and waited. A few hours later, a coroner arrived. Detectives began to check for injuries and immediately discovered the body was a female sex doll. The doll was anatomically correct with realistic skin and features and was fully dressed. That's a direct quote from the authorities, and it warms my heart to know that that's now sitting in a police file cabinet. The detective went on to say, quote, in all my years, I have never encountered a situation like this. And to be fair, he probably never will again. I think it's a funny story. I'm not sure how the doll got there. I'm not sure if it was deliberately placed there as a prank, to make people think somebody had been hit by a train. Unfortunately, the story doesn't disclose whether or not the doll was clothed or not. I think that's kind of an important detail, or at least when it comes to how I'm imagining how this went down. Now, I actually used to work a lot on trains. I was an engineer for the overhead contact systems for light rails. And these kinds of accidents actually happen all the time, where the engineer will just hear a thump and the side of this train will just be sprayed red. It's pretty gruesome the way train deaths work. So they probably should have known right away that this wasn't actually a human being, because it would have been splattered and exploded everywhere. I shouldn't laugh at that, but it's the only way I can cope, people. But it happens a lot. One time there was also a corpse that was stabbed 47 times right in front of my train that I was testing. So I just had to pull up my testing train right up to the body and wait for 3 hours while the police came. And I watched them do what they did with this mannequin. They threw a drape over it, and then we waited for about 3 hours for the coroner to come and investigate. And he's like, yeah, it was probably the 38th stab that got this guy. What happens on train tracks is pretty gruesome. That's where the real underbelly of society is displayed at its most devious capacity. So I don't actually blame these cops for misunderstanding the situation. In fact, I think this story is a happy one. It wasn't a person who made a mistake or somebody who, hurt themselves or somebody that was killed. It was just a sex doll. Hooray! But anyway, this isn't the only time a sex doll was mistaken for a human body. In 2018, I can't believe I actually had to dig deeper into this. This is one of the few podcasts, and I'm sure that people host and then clear their history after researching. Anyway, this doll was discovered in a nature preserve in Hamilton County, Ohio, in October 2018. It's the same basic story. The police weren't allowed to touch the body until a coroner arrived, so they placed a cloth over it. And when the coroner did arrive, he discovered it was, in fact, a doll. And before the coroner showed up, the police took a bunch of photos of the scene, as they do with all crime scenes, and eventually these photos surfaced, and the media began to memorialize the, quote, recreational mannequin. Recreational mannequin. And they named her Mandy, which is nice. And even more heartwarmingly, civilians left flowers, candles, and balloons at Lick Road near where the incident took place. This is in remembrance of the mannequin's death. Quote, Mandy, you were taken too soon. We will remember you fondly. R.I.P. That's a sign that now lays where the mannequin body was found. And then there was actually a third incidence of this occurring. In Australia, a sex doll was found dumped on the side of a highway. When authorities first came by it, they assumed it was just a body wrapped in a blanket, which is a pretty gross thing to assume. The doll's name was Naomi. I like how they name all these dolls. I'm kind of upset that the new one found was never named. But it was found next to its user manual. The police statement read, quote, forensic officers commenced investigations, which have concluded the body is a lifelike replica doll of a human. The crime scene has been disbanded. Officers continue investigations into the origins of the doll. So they're actually continuing to investigate the situation in Australia, which I think is great. There's so little crime there that they really have enough time on their hands to investigate where this doll came from. As if only dedicated to humiliating whoever couldn't figure out how to use the doll. They went on to say, quote, to properly dispose of your sex doll, you can either take it directly to a dump, look into selling it used, believe it or not, there is a market, or you can go green and contact a sex doll recycling service. That's the best. That's also in a police record now, which is just amazing. I'd love to go through those records one day. Anyways, it's time for our next sexy story. Alright, naked man arrested says he used mushrooms with Jesus. I used to try that one in school. It never worked. So this story begins in Kentucky, where several deputies found a man naked during a burglary in progress. When deputies arrived, they say they saw, quote, a man inside the home naked with blood and mud on his body. The authorities go on to say that the man started walking towards the deputies, ignoring their commands to get on the ground. They say he then started running at the deputies while yelling. That's when they say the deputy tased the man, causing him to fall to the ground. Once the man was placed in handcuffs, he then jumped up and he started running around and colliding with the policemen themselves. The 41-year-old was eventually recaptured and taken into custody. In his defense, the man said, quote, I used mushrooms with Jesus, and that they were playing a virtual reality game together. And I'm now going to describe the crime scene. It's kind of gruesome. Apparently there were holes punched in the drywall, blood was smeared on several walls and windows, and several pieces of broken glass were laying on the floor. So this guy was clearly tripping. He broke into a house and started smashing stuff, bleeding everywhere, smearing on the walls. It was kind of gross. But all is well that ends well. The man is now facing several charges, including indecent exposure, burglary, criminal mischief, resisting arrest, and public intoxication and menacing. All right, and for the final not-so-sexy story of the week, a Portland protester goes nude once police run out of tear gas. And a Portland protester stripped naked in front of the anti-riot police officers in the middle of a standoff during the weekend demonstrations against anti-black racism. The protester was then given the name Naked Athena, and she was, quote, clad in just a black beanie and black face mask. And apparently after about 10 minutes after she showed up, the police officers left the scene. I guess they knew that this would likely become a popular story over the weekend, and didn't want to be associated with it. It's important to note that in Portland, quote, public nudity is only illegal if done with the intent to arouse. That should be like the tagline for every single law. Fully automatic weapons are only illegal if done with the intent to arouse. Robbing a liquor store is only illegal if done with the intent to arouse. Any form of arousal should be illegal. But as a result of this little Portlandian law, courts have recognized the act as a form of political protest that overrides public decency laws. So even if the lady was not anonymous, she would not be arrested for indecency, as some of the ladies mentioned earlier in the story were. She would in fact just be considered a peaceful protester. Good for her. And the funniest part for me in this is that it inspired copycat protesters. So now not only in Portland, but all across America, people are protesting, brutality by stripping down naked. Which I think is what Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. would really want. I'm not just saying that for my personal gains, folks. This is a matter of civil rights. We'll see how this turns out. It's de-escalating the situation, so I have little qualms with this event. But we're going to go to a break now. So stay tuned. After the break, we're going to talk about my top 10 god-dang insurance fraud schemes. I think it'll be a heck of a time, so why don't you stick around, and we'll discuss that.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Abraham Lincoln's dog Fido was also assassinated. Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We're gonna go through my top 10 insurance fraud scams, insurance fraud scam cases, and whatnot. The first one comes from a man living in Chicago who burned down his house as part of an insurance fraud scam. So, in desperation, he torched his house expecting to get $730,000 of insurance money in return. But this was a smart fella. He knew he had to go all out in order to convince them that this was an accidental fire. So what he did is he left his 90-year-old mother doused in the basement in gasoline. I know it's not funny that it happened, but it's kind of funny how it happened. So he lit his house on fire with his mother in the basement, which has landed him 190 years in federal prison. Now, one insurance fraud expert says that this is part of the result of one of the worst downtimes in the economy. So this was during the 2008 crash. He went on to say, quote, "People in small but increasingly numbers are burning down their homes. Often the houses went up in smoke and flames just before the homes were to be foreclosed. People were upside down on their mortgages. They felt concerned financially, and in acts of desperation, they burned down their own homes. People would also report that their stereo was stolen. Maybe it was worth $3,000, but they would claim it was worth $8,000. Diamond wedding and engagement rings started seriously getting lost. That kind of crime could net a few $1,000s and become more prevalent than ever." So, yeah, I think Quiggle's kind of missing the problem with this story. That's the guy who said all those things. His name is Quiggle. But he's missing the point. You know, the guy burned his mom for insurance money. That is so not okay to laugh at. KO number 9. Waiter, there's a mouse in my soup. So this comes from Clara Patterson, who, while in a Crackle Barrel restaurant, tried to sue for $500,000 because there was a mouse in her soup. But the chain investigated and found that the mouse had no soup in its lungs and had not been cooked. So the mouse was added after the soup was served. And as a result, Miss Clara Patterson was sentenced to a year in prison. Quiggles, the expert named earlier, said, quote, "That's one form of extortion. Swindlers will target restaurants to make quick windfall in a belief that the eatery doesn't want the negative publicity and will quietly pay the claim on the theory that the claimant isn't going to go to the media. If you claim that you found a worm in your soft drink, the company can go right back to its production procedures and determine with certainty that a worm never could have gotten into that drink. They go to great lengths to determine the claim to see if it's valid or not." So a lot of these restaurants and food producers will have organizational structures in place to prevent such fraud conspiracies, which I think is great. People go around suing everybody left and right. Not okay, folks. All right, number 8. So this is a life insurance fraud. These are the best ones. So a couple, one member of the couple, the male part of the couple, was on run from the law, And he had an idea. So what he did is he had an idea to get his wife some extra money. So what they did is they went to a grave, they dug up an old woman, dressed the woman in the wife's clothes, put her in a car, set the car on fire, and pushed it off a cliff. So if anybody wants to look this up, it's the Clayton Life Insurance phony death. That's what you can Google. And by making it seem like the man's wife had died, he would collect $110,000 for a life insurance policy. But unfortunately, the insurance company insisted on DNA tests, which turns out didn't match. This stunt ended both members of the couple in prison for several years. All right, number 7. So this occurred in a Houston high school. And a chemistry teacher got tired of paying for her Chevy Malibu every month. So what she did is she approached 2 failing students and offered them passing grades in exchange for them torching her car for the insurance money. She ended up serving 90 days in prison. That's a nice short and sweet one. Speaking of short and sweet, grandmas. Alright, so number 6, the fake fall and slips gag. Alright, so this usually happens when an old person is finding themselves in financial trouble. So this one lady faked that she slipped in a market store. Oh wait, no, not a market store. In 49 market stores. Totaling $500,000 during her long career as an insurance fraud person. I don't know the technical term. But in her defense, she said, I faked this 49 times, totaling $500,000 as, quote, a byproduct of my gambling addiction. That's kind of sad. But she found a scheme and she took advantage of it. She got away with it 48 times. It wasn't until the 49th where she pushed it over the limit and somebody caught her. Kind of bizarre that nobody noticed that before. And the reason this worked out is because most companies have a minimum amount of insurance money they're willing to pay right off the bat before they even initiate a lawsuit. So, for instance, the company I used to work for, I won't disclose the name of the company, but they would pay up to $10,000 before they actually would start a lawsuit. So even if it was a phony lawsuit, they would pay $10,000 right out of the gate in order to avoid having to deal with a lawsuit altogether. So that's how she got away with it 49 times until finally somebody called her out. All right, so this number 5 one is kind of a spooky. So for those who are squeamish, you might want to skip past this one. But back in 2008, a man chopped off his friend's hand and used it to claim multiple insurance scams. So he cut off his friend's hand using a chainsaw, and he proceeded to claim accidental death and homeowners insurance policy scams, and received a total of $671,000. And thankfully he was recently convicted and faces $250,000 fine. So he'll have to give a third of that money back. So that's good news. He'll also spend 20 years in prison, which is even better news. So yeah. Some people are willing to cut off their friend's hand in order to get ahead. All right, let's move on to number 4. All right, number 4. I find this one very hilarious. So, a man was walking down the street and he saw a bus get in a crash, and he saw his opportunity for a get-rich-quick scheme. He ran onto the bus, clutched his back, and screamed, "Ah, you broke my back!" But it was all caught on camera, so there's a really funny video online that you can find where this man runs onto the bus after it crashes and starts screaming in pain. The man was eventually fined $1,000 and sentenced to 2 years of probation. And he entertained us all, so that's why he got off so easily. All right, number 3. So this one actually comes from a police cop in New Jersey who reported his car stolen, but he then drove the car for the next 3 years. So the man collected about $10,000 from his insurance company at the time, but eventually one of his insurance representatives happened to see the same car parked outside of his home 3 years later. And he called into the insurance company, and they investigated and found out that it was the man himself driving his own stolen car. The only security this cop had in order to hide the fact that he stole his own car for insurance money is that he switched the license plates. And he's now being tried, and if convicted, he'll face 5 years in prison and a $15,000 fine. So there are serious consequences, people, to being a bad person. Don't be a bad person. All right, number 2. This also comes from a cop. So he was actually a school police officer, and when he was 31, he claimed that a man with a ponytail and bomber-style jacket shot him in the chest. So he was on patrol in 2011 and made the claim that he was shot in the chest during school hours, and so the entire area was combed for about 10 hours as 550 police officers searched for the man the cop claimed shot him. And 9 different schools were locked down during this period as a result of the claim. But eventually no shooter ever turned up. And the cop couldn't keep his story straight about how many shots had been fired. And eventually the real story unraveled. Prosecutors successfully claimed that the man shot himself, and he was wearing a bulletproof vest at the time in order to protect himself. He was eventually convicted of planting false evidence and insurance fraud in September of 2011. The judge fined him $309,000 in restitution to the city. So he has to pay for all of the 550 cops he had searching the area while the 9 schools closed down. Tough gig. Alright, quick honorable mention. A security camera caught 2 jeweler wholesalers staging a robbery at their own store. In 2008, all these stories are occurring around the 2008 crash, so it's kind of sad to see how such horrible events in American history cause all of these insurance fraud scams to occur. Anyway, 2 New York City business partners organized a fake heist at their own jewelry store. So, long story short, they burned all their own video tracks and wrecked the entire store and ended up claiming a $7 million claim with their insurer. But eventually the police managed to salvage some of the footage destroyed during the fake robbery. And as a result, the pair was convicted of insurance fraud in the first degree and an attempted grand larceny and falsification of business records. So they were actually also accused of the robbery itself. I find that one very funny. Alright, and finally, number 1. A Delaware man claims a freak cooking accident caused his home and convertible to burn down. And the unbelievable part of this story kind of unravels itself as the man tells it. Quote, I tried to put the fire out with a dish rag, but the dish rag caught fire. So I took one pan and threw it out the front door, where it landed in the back seat of my convertible. I then took the second pan and was going to throw it out, but tipped over a box, and the pan landed on a leather couch, igniting it. I ran outside to get 2 hoses, but there was only one there, so I attempted to put out the fire in the convertible. That was the man's story. Isn't that beautiful? I could never write a story that funny. That's amazing. Eventually, the state court ordered him to pay $37,997 in restitution and sentence him to 5 years of probation for second and third degree attempted insurance fraud. So that's kind of a tragic ending to that hilarious story. I hope this man at least gets to keep the film rights to his own insurance fraud scheme. I would feel especially bad if all these really horrible events actually occurred and the guy's house actually did go up accidentally as a result of all these crazy incidences. But I suppose we will never know. That's the real tragic part about these stories. You can never know for sure, but a couple of these seem self-evident. But anyways, that wraps up this week's weird news. And so I'm going to have to thank you for listening to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And I'm also going to ask, as usual, that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a goddamn nice review, because that helps us a lot. And if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, that would be great. Thank you, and have a good night.